We did an interview for, I think, Indigenous Peoples Day with Peter DeErico, who is a professor emeritus from UMass, also an Indian a lawyer who practices Indian law. And that was the first time I had heard about this doctrine of discovery, which is really, I mean, fundamental to your treatise, that the start of white supremacy predates slavery in this country, at least, chattel slavery and 1619. Tell us about that.
No, that's right. So, this word, the doctrine of discovery that you mentioned, I think is a term that many of us don't know. In fact, if you had asked me about this, 5 years ago, I would have stared at you fairly blankly. And I've got a PhD in religion, had all kinds of, American history courses throughout my education, yet it was not something that was taught to me, not something that registered to me. But as you say, it is the thing that really explains the moral compass that Europeans really brought with them, and when they landed on these shores of not just of the United States, what we now know as the United States, but the Americas, written more broadly. But in brief, essentially what happened was, right, with the quote unquote discovery of these lands that Europeans did not know existed, and people that Europeans did not know existed, it created a moral and kind of theological crisis. And the real question was, well, what rights do these people have that Europeans are bound to respect? And so they looked to the closest thing to international law that existed at that time for the answer to that question, and that was the Christian church in Europe. And at that time, it was before the Protestant Catholic split, so it was the Roman Catholic Church and the head of the church in the Vatican, the Pope in Rome, and they began to develop this doctrine called the Doctrine of Discovery. And it essentially, there's a lot of theological apparatus, but it essentially boiled down to this. To answer the question about whether these people had, basic human rights that Europeans were bound to respect, they answered that question with a question. And the question was, well, are they Christian? And of course, they knew the answer to that question. And if the answer was no, they went on to spell out then that Europeans, because of their quote unquote superior, not only a kind of ethnic identity, but superior religion, had the right then to occupy those lands, to steal their goods. And the documents actually spell it out in black and white, like, this is a direct quote, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Right? And that is from the head of the church there. And that really is what sets the moral compass for the first European contact with indigenous people that ultimately also carries over into the transatlantic slave trade.
And so we should just be clear. We're talking about, the 1400s, ranging. I think there was a document in 1452, and then one in the early 1490s, and it's Pope Alexander VI who creates this doctrine, and the really shocking thing about this doctrine to me, because, we had divine rights of kings and of the sort of these type of doctrines that, were created in this era. This one has been incredibly durable to the point where it is embedded in U.S. constitutional law, has been referenced. We're not talking just back in like the 1820s. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, without, I think, saying the words. This is what the amazing thing was is that this doctrine is referenced maybe through its case law, but the original case law referenced the doctrine of discovery, and it is the fundamental principle that we use in Indian law today in this country. Will you walk us through that a little bit? Because I think the idea that you're showing is that this strain of thinking, this dynamic, exists through our country from its pre-founding, and to see it so embedded with even the liberal icon on the Supreme Court, I think really illustrates that point.
No, that's exactly right. So it may sound kind of quaint, right? If we say, okay, well, this was, these were doctrines in the church from 1452 to 1493. That's a long time ago. So how does this really affect us today? And I should say that year 1493 is the one that's really particular to the Americas, because that's when Columbus actually goes back, all right, and says, I really want a specific moral mandate for the whole colonial settler project, and that's when he gets this additional edict from the Pope in 1493. But it does carry through, and so you think about it, it is the basic claim that, again, that Europeans, both in terms of the terms you hear all the time, or in terms of their civilization and their religion, are superior to the indigenous people here. They're superior to Africans. By using that phrase, civilization and Christianity show up over and over again. And as you say, it gets embedded not just in our kind of moral consciousness and in our culture and our churches, but it gets embedded in U.S. law. So, the kind of main document is in the 1820s, Johnson v. McIntosh, where this just gets spelled out, and it uses that language. In the case law, it says, the superior genius of Europe and justified the taking of these lands, and in exchange, they were given, the indigenous people were given civilization and Christianity. That was the bargain, and that was seen to be a just bargain, and that's the thing that really sets U.S. case law. And you're right, in the early 2000s, Ruth Bader Ginsburg cites footnote number 1 back to this case law that goes all the way back to this idea.
And we should say, I mean, that case was Sherrill, the city of Sherrill versus the Oneida Nation of New York. Folks can go back and listen to the D'Errico interview to sort of like hear this, how this doctrine travels, to our present day regarding Indian law. In fact, there was a case, I think, a year ago that supposedly was received well by advocates of indigenous people, but again, maintained this doctrine in a way that just the outcome worked out.